I'm Rob Boyd, and I'm going to talk to you about foragers and public goods. Thanks to Sergey, Nathan, and Michelle for inviting me, and whoever put me first. Special thanks. Not only don't I have a hard act to follow, I have no act to follow. So what I want to do is present evidence that human foragers are not, the picture that we often are given of human foragers is really not correct. That human foragers engage in large-scale cooperation with non-relatives. And as a consequence, when we're thinking about the evolution of norms, we should think of the history of norms as going well back into the Pleistocene. So if you read something that comes out of Santa Barbara or various other places, actually lots of places, the picture of foraging life that we're given is one of people living in small bands, cooperating in providing food and providing mutual aid, but the cooperation is on small scales. For example, Chris Bohm has a nice book on the evolution of morality, and he's created a database of foraging groups. And in that database, he insists that the groups are ethnographically known, which means they were studied by professional ethnographers in basically the 20th century. They're egalitarian, nomadic, they have no food storage, and they live in multifamily bands. The requirement that they're ethnographically known excludes a lot of aspects of forager behavior because every ethnographically well-known forager group lives in a marginal habitat surrounded by farmers, does not engage in warfare, and has many other aspects of its behavior that are as a consequence of not being in a world of foragers amongst foragers. And what I want to convince you of is in that kind of world, foragers actually behave quite differently. And that, in fact, we can see there's lots of evidence for large scale, meaning more than 100 people cooperating in an activity. And I hope to convince you that that means that reciprocity and kin selection cannot be the driving forces behind that kind of cooperation. Cooperation in large groups requires sanctions or rewards that can be targeted on individuals, and that requires social norms. Okay, so mainly this is going to be empirical talk about what we can know about forager life from historical and archaeological data. No, that's not working, so we'll do it this way. Okay, so I've already said this, size matters. Kinship and reciprocity are not the explanation for cooperation in groups of 50 or 100 or 200 people. So let me explain why, and I'm going to explain why within a context of an example. This is an archaeological site there in eastern Colorado. It's called the Olson-Chubbuck site, and at that site a huge number of bison bones were found. This is the bison occidentalis. It was it's an ancestor of the modern bison, about half again as big. And this site represents a single kill, and there were various ways of estimating the number of individuals, but it would have added up to about 56,000 pounds of buffalo meat harvested in a single day or two. And so this site dates to about 9,000 years ago. These are the first hunter-gatherers that reached North America, no horses yet. How did it work? Well, we know from historical accounts by mountain men and trappers and such that visited the Great Plains in the end of the 18th century that pedestrian buffalo hunters worked like this. There's various ways, but one way is you have a group of people, they make a big arc around a herd working against the wind so they can get close enough to the buffalo to frighten them. The buffalo herd coalesces, and cunningly, they're being driven towards a ravine. The ravine narrows to a place where the slope is steep on both sides, and hunters await, and on this day, they killed enough buffalo to harvest 56,000 pounds of meat. So why do we need norms? Let's suppose that we have another guy back here, and he lags back. Buffalo, it turns out, in this kind of drive, sometimes turned around and charged the people that were trying to drive them into the ravine. And so being on the driving side was not a cost-free thing to do. So that guy, by hanging back, has a benefit. There's 150 people. The person who did the excavation estimates 150 people were involved in this drive. So take one away, it has almost no effect on the amount of meat that's harvested. So he can withdraw and have no direct cost to himself, and reciprocity is not going to work, right? We can't make this guy cooperate by saying we won't cooperate unless you cooperate, because then the whole thing will collapse and we won't be able to hunt the meat. Reciprocity in the sense of I'll help you if you help me works fine for pairs or small groups, but to motivate people to cooperate in large numbers like this, we need sanctions that can be directed at an individual, sanctions or rewards, and that means social norms. So the rest of the talk, I'm going to give you a bunch of examples of large-scale cooperation we know from archaeological or historical data. And in the end, I hope you'll be convinced that there's a good case to be made that Holocene hunter-gatherers and probably Pleistocene hunter-gatherers cooperated in large numbers, and therefore they had societies regulated by social norms, at least at the tribal scale. And so when we're thinking about the evolution of norm psychology, of pro-social motives, and all these kinds of things, we should be thinking not about a tiny band with 15 or 20 people in it. We should be thinking of a tribe with 500 or 1,000 people in it. Okay, so let's have some examples. This kind of collective hunting was extremely common in North America before horses arrived. There's a site in southern Alberta, has the lovely name Head Smashed Inn, where beginning about 5,500 years ago, Native Americans drove bison over a small cliff, it's about 10 meters, for 5,000 years. And there's actually, it's only 10 meters now. When it started, it was 25 meters. The bottom 15 meters are buffalo bones, bison bones. And this is another aspect of it, a more common way of organizing these things, is foragers built drive lines. So these are fences, usually with stone foundations, and then brush and other kinds of like buffalo robes strung on these fences. The buffalo were brought into this. Apparently buffalo don't see very well, or bison don't see very well. And once they got going, they would be afraid to challenge these fences that they could have easily run straight through, but they didn't. They got narrower and narrower and narrower, and here's the cliff where they go off and are harvested. Now what I want you to notice is, here's the scale. These things are several kilometers long. So people are building fences in order to harvest buffalo that are several kilometers long. This is a classic public good, right? It's a shared facility. We have something that everybody gets to use. It produces lots of food for all of us, but it requires us to cooperate in numbers that are beyond the sort of family band scale. Okay, these things are really common. So this is Alberta. That's Head Smashed Inn. These are other sites, not so famous, not so big, but have basically the same character. There are buffalo jumps with long drive lines associated with them. I couldn't find a map of all the jumps in the Great Plains because there are too many, but this is a sampler of the map of jumps that have been And they date from, this is the oldest one here at Bonfire Shelter. That dates to 12,000 years ago. Basically, as soon as people got to North America, they started killing bison this way. And if you look in detail at any of the smaller scale, you'll see each of those dots represents several jumps. So there were a lot of jumps, and they lasted for a long time, basically from when people got to North America to when they got horses, and horses changed everything and made it much easier to hunt bison. This is Bonfire Shelter. There's a little bit of controversy about whether this is actually a buffalo jump. There's a huge pile of bison bones at the bottom, and the first people who excavated it thought it was. The second group came in and said, no, it's not, and now there's a group from New Mexico working on it, and we'll know for sure whether it is or isn't. Okay, now, this is not just something that's specialized for bison. This kind of communal hunting was used all through North America for a wide variety of game. So this is a drawing of a drive line and a corral, a drift fence and a corral from a site called Whiskey Creek in, it's just a little bit north and east of Mono Lake, if you know that part of California. This was meant to harvest pronghorn antelope. Here the deal is you drive the antelope against this fence. They are drifting along the fence. They're pushed finally down, and they enter this corral where hunters are standing around the fences with bows and arrows and shooting the pronghorn. Now the thing that you have to realize is that constructing one of these things is a fairly big project. So this fence here was 2.3 kilometers long. It had 5,000 fence posts. So you had to have enough people, and you had to feed them to build a fence that was 1.2 kilometers long. And this kind of thing is all over the Great Basin. Here's another one. This is from a site called Fort Sage. This one was a stone fence. It's about 1 kilometer long. And some intrepid archaeologists from the Nevada, one of the Nevada government offices decided to do an experiment and figure out how long it would take to build this thing. They lasted about 8 hours and reported that they finished exhausted. And based on their estimates, it would take something like 208 person days of their person days, 8-hour days, to construct this thing. And here's a map of structures like this in just the Great Basin. There's other, there's also hunting in Wyoming and farther east. But you can see that this is not a one-off thing or a rare thing. All across North America, people were building large constructions in order to hunt communally. Constructions that are too big to be, I think, to be imagined to be built on the band scale. So I'm just going to beat you to death with examples. This is from I forget the name of the island. I think it's King William Island. It's almost the westernmost of those islands in Canada. You can see here a stone fence. This one's about 0.5 kilometer long. These were built to corral and drive caribou by Inuit, and before them by Dorset people. Same deal, big long fences, lots of labor. There's no wood around, they're all built out of stone. Now the oldest, this one's only about 1,000 years old, but there's a fence under Lake Michigan. So when the glaciers hadn't completely melted, there was a isthmus across Lake Huron. And archaeologists have found here a clear drive line used for caribou 9,000 years ago in Lake Michigan. So for at least the whole Holocene, North American hunter-gatherers have been constructing substantial constructions to hunt large animals. That's the hard evidence. There's some not so hard evidence that people have been doing this for a lot longer. So this is from Lascaux Cave in the Pyrenees. And you can see this line of dots leading to a square, and another line of dots leading to a square. Horses are running into that. Thomas Kehoe, who's a now dead archaeologist, wrote a book arguing that this and a number of other features of cave paintings indicate that these Upper Paleolithic hunters 17 or 18,000 years ago were using drive lines. You see these things he interprets as corrals. And there's a little bit of archaeological evidence that, this is a site in Germany where dates to around 55 or 60,000 years old, so almost certainly Neanderthals, drove reindeer in the same kind of style that at Olsen-Chubbuck into a narrowing ravine and killed them. Okay, now this is not the only kind of public goods that foragers make. So communal hunting is one thing. There are lots of others. So people all over the world do things to change the habitat to make it more productive. The most common is burning. People burn. That creates successional environments. The kinds of plants that grow are more productive, more mammalian biomass. This is a pure public good. The guy who burns the fields pays the cost. Anybody who hunts in that area gets the benefit. There are lots of other examples like this. People sowed seed in sandbars or silt bars on the Mississippi. People cut down trees in the forest in the Amazon to let beetles create beetle habitat so you could eat those yummy beetle grubs, etc. Lots and lots of examples. The most spectacular ones are waterworks built by hunter-gatherers. So this is great because it's from, this is where those blue spots are, is where Bishop, California is today. This is the Paiute, one of the most famous mobile hunter-gatherer groups studied. No, I have 10 minutes, Sergey. Oh, until talk. Okay. I'm not going to quite make. Anyway, those blue lines up there are ditches that are about 3 kilometers long. The Paiute, who are classic nomadic hunter-gatherers, built those to increase habitat for these kinds of bulb-producing plants, which they liked. So they dug a ditch that was 3 kilometers long. Same thing happened in other parts of the world. Here's an example from Australia. This is a ditch. Where's the scale? So that's 500 meters. You can see that ditch is several kilometers long. It was meant to drain that swampy area and create an environment where it was easier to harvest eels. Fish traps are really common all over the world. These are the fish traps from Queensland. Some of them are quite big. Most of them are fairly recent, but some go well back into the Holocene. These are the Queensland fish traps. Here are the fish traps in southern Australia, tons of them. Again, big constructions, lots of people involved, and not the kind of thing that a band is going to manage. This is a weir built across a river in Northern California. I know all the details. It took hundreds of people, but I will skip that. In interest of our last public good, which is warfare, this is the aftermath of Stalingrad. Each of those guys paid a big cost. Benefits of victory or defeat flowed to nations, but so their costs are it's obviously a public good. Now, a lot of people think that human foragers make war like chimpanzees. Chimpanzees go on patrol. They have conflicts with their neighbors, but only if their neighbors are grotesquely outnumbered. So they want basically to have 10-to-1 kinds of numbers. Richard Wrangham defended this view some years ago that hunter-gatherer warfare was all a matter of ambush in situations where you knew you would win. I think he's changed that view lately. Bonfire could tell us. I think the evidence is in hunter-gatherer world with hunter-gatherers, hunter-gatherers engage in much larger scale combat. So this is William Buckley, not our William Buckley, but another William Buckley who was transported to Australia. He ran away because he didn't like his slavery situation that much. He spent 30 years with a group of Australian Aborigines. I recommend this book to you. His picture of Australian hunter-gatherer life is saturated with violence on all scales: murder, raids of the chimpanzee kind, and large-scale battles involving hundreds of people on each side. Azar Gott wrote a paper a few years ago in Evolutionary Anthropology summarizing what was known about Australian forager warfare, and this picture is amply backed up by more scholarly, again, historical materials, but scholarly analysis of historical materials. So how far back does this go? This is a drawing which is really hard to see. There are 60 people in this drawing. Their spears flying through the air. It's from Arnhem Land in northern Australia. It dates to about 6,000 years ago. It's a pretty clear example of warfare. Warfare in North America. These are the Numic-speaking groups that spread across the Great Basin in, between about 1000 AD and the arrival of Europeans. Here, all along the western edge, at contact, there was large-scale pedestrian warfare, infantry warfare going on between the expanding Numic speakers, the Shoshone and the Utes, and the previous residents of the Great Plains. One more example. This is from Ernest Birch's work on Northwest Alaska. These are the so-called nations, tribes. They were involved in regular warfare with each other on fairly large scales. The goal of warfare was the extermination of the other guys. And if you have a romantic view of hunter-gatherers, I urge you to read Birch's book, because it's full of stuff that I couldn't repeat in this audience. Just unbelievable cruelty involved. Okay. Sergei says I have no time, so I'm done. I think this points to a long history of large-scale cooperation in humans. And so when we're talking about the evolution of norms, we should think about this on genetic evolutionary timescales, not just cultural evolutionary timescales. Thanks. Six. He cheated me.
Thank you. That was really interesting. So I'm not an evolutionary anthropologist, so forgive me if this question is sillier. But what's the difference between your social normative explanation and indirect
Reciprocity.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. So there's been a kind of, in my view, is there any Martin Novak people here? I think there's been a kind of a misinterpretation of the indirect reciprocity story. So the basic models work like this. Individuals are drawn from a population, they're paired. I've never interacted in the starkest model. I've never interacted with you before, but I know how you've behaved in the past. You have a reputation for being a nice guy, I cooperate with you. This fellow over here, not such a nice guy, and I don't cooperate with him. That's pairwise. And it runs on its own because there's a net benefit. We assort, and we both can get a benefit from doing it that way. It doesn't work if I meet 100 people and I have to decide whether to cooperate with them. Because now my payoffs, both due to if it costs me something to punish or maybe not, are decoupled by the 1/n factor from the payoff to the group. So you can make reciprocity, indirect reciprocity, be that kind of reputational payoff can be what is the sanction for that guy that lags back. He doesn't get something. But that won't arise just out of the, you need something to explain why reputation gets attached to that. So you're obligated to help him when he breaks his leg. In the normal pairwise reciprocity, he's a coward in the battle. It's got nothing to do with your leg. But in many systems, you don't help him because he's got a bad reputation for something. He's a bad guy, but not a bad guy and he didn't help in the indirect reciprocity rule. He didn't act in some public good situation. Those are perfectly cogent models. Karthik, Panchanathan, and I published a paper showing that a long time ago. So indirect reciprocity, actually I think that's the main way that reputation works. But it's not a complete explanation. It doesn't explain why reputation gets attached to things that provide a group benefit.
I have a different question. So when you started talking about human warfare,
Yeah.
that is obviously a public good. And is this really true in kind of modern heterogeneous societies? And why is it so obvious that
The benefit, think of being a fighter in, you have to think of this absent the institutions that are asking men to fight. But think of a man who's risking his life at Stalingrad. The victory or defeat can mean, well, what defeat means is rape and death and all kinds of terrible things. But that flows to your wife and your daughter whether or not you participate, right? Or whether you hide in a foxhole or so the costs you experience are small and the benefit flows to everyone. So it's a
okay, so this is once the enterprise is running. So it's not about the decision to start, say, aggressive war or so. As a society, it's more like once I'm part of this, I'm stuck in public good.
Well, of course, modern war is complicated, but in these hunter-gatherer wars, that really there is nothing runs. You can't feed an army very long. These things are people sit around. Actually, we don't know too much about Australia's the actual machinery, but in North America, it's entrepreneurial. Some guy will go around and say, "I want to go raid. I'm a Comanche, and I want to go raid the Utes." And he sends out little boys, and they go to all the settlements, and people show up. And the benefit is deterrence of them, new territory. We get a lot of horses in the case of things. But that's a public good too, right? Because the horses come as a group, and then we have to have norms to split them up. Yeah.
We have time for one very quick question. Can I ask one?
Sure.
Is there a date associated with the last picture that you had? It's not there, but where you have many people.
6,000 years ago, between 6 and 9.
It's still the same Australian site.
Oh, that one? No, with all the people? That was going to be my just, yucking it up slide. That's from a site in eastern Spain that is dated to about 9,000 years ago, between 9 and 7. The tricky bit is, I wasn't going to use that as data, but they may have already been farmers. It's not clear. There's a big argument, basically, about whether those sites are Mesolithic or Neolithic sites.
Yes, so warfare clearly shows up as the most powerful force to produce cooperation, at least in models.
Mm-hmm.
But one argument that for me was very strong against it is that there is pretty much complete
Oh no, there's lots in Australia. Lots. I can send you references. They're not in places.
But not in Europe. Nowhere in Europe.
No, in Europe, there's no pictures of people at all, hardly, until quite late. So Upper Paleolithic artists, for whatever reason, didn't paint people. There's also the hands, yeah, yeah, but no, nothing like you see in southern Africa or in Australia or in North America with all these skinny little people running around. Okay.
Sophia.